Hey guys! Tonight we're wandering into the cold breath of the ancient world. Imagine the crunch of frost underfoot, the walls of a cave beaded with condensation, and a single, fragile bone resting quietly in the dark, forgotten for tens of thousands of years, until a curious hand found it again. That's where our story begins. Deep in the Altai mountains of Siberia, in a limestone cave called Denisova, something quietly waited. Not a skull. Not a full skeleton. Just a shard, a pinky finger, smooth and silent, smaller than a cigarette, but weighty enough to rattle the foundations of everything we thought we knew about being human. The world you're about to fall asleep to was colder, quieter, and wilder than ours. No electric hums. No digital clocks. Just the hush of snow falling on pine branches and the crackle of fire from inside a shelter carved into the side of a mountain. This is not the world of Homo sapiens. Not exactly. It's the world of someone else. A cousin. A shadow. A people long lost and only barely remembered, not by books or bones, but by secrets buried deep inside ourselves. You probably won't survive this Ice Age trek barefoot, and honestly, Denisovans wouldn't recommend it either. But you're here now, bundled beneath your blanket, spine relaxed, phone dimmed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Denisova cave lies tucked inside the Altai mountain range, bordered by forests that sway like tired giants and rivers that murmur to themselves in ancient dialects. Long ago, this cave served as shelter, not just for one kind of human, but for several. It was like a biological Airbnb, visited by Neanderthals, modern humans, and another species no one even knew existed, until recently. Inside this cave, archaeologists uncovered layers of sediment, each one a page in time's dusty diary. In one layer, the remains of an extinct horse. In another, a stone bracelet, dark green and polished, with a drilled hole that suggests the wearer had more than just survival in mind. Beneath that, the pinky bone. When scientists ran tests on the bone's DNA, they expected to find Neanderthal genes. Or maybe those of a modern human who'd wandered in from the steppes. But no. The genetic code was something entirely different. Close to us, yes, close enough to count as family, but distinctly, unmistakably other. That's when the whispers began in the scientific community. Whispers of a people no one had ever met. No skulls. No full skeletons. Just a pinky. And a molar the size of a gumdrop. But even so, the world had a new name, the Denisovans. They didn't name themselves, of course. We did. After the cave. After Denis, a 19th century hermit who once lived there, his name becoming the accidental label for an entire branch of humanity. Imagine that. Your name passed on not to a child, but to a whole lost people. So who were they? What did they look like? Did they laugh, love, dream? Did they sit around fires telling stories of sky spirits or glacier beasts? The answers don't come easy. The Denisovans left behind almost nothing of themselves. But that nothing is louder than silence. It calls to us across the millennia. And if we're quiet enough, it just might tell us something back. As you settle into your pillow, let your mind wander. Picture them, short, broad-shouldered figures moving through the snow, stone tools in hand, wrapped in furs. Not quite us. Not quite Neanderthals. Something in between. A branch that grew alongside ours, blossomed in high-altitude forests, and vanished before we even knew it existed. They likely had broad faces, strong jaws, and perhaps darker skin than Neanderthals or modern Europeans. Their bodies were suited for the cold, thick bones and wide chests, built to trap warmth. But what did their eyes look like when they gazed across a frozen river at dusk? Were they hunting? Praying? Wondering what lay beyond? Science doesn't always know how to answer those questions. But imagination does. And sometimes, when facts are scarce and silence is thick, that's enough. So here we are, back in the cave. Cold breath clouds the air. Somewhere nearby, a stone blade lies buried. Someone once held it in their hand. Someone with Denisovan blood. Maybe they etched something on the wall. Maybe they hummed a tune to themselves in the dark. Maybe they reached for a child's hand, as the winds howled outside. You'll never meet them, not face to face. But that's the strange beauty of the Denisovans. You don't have to. Because pieces of them still walk the earth, hidden in high cheekbones, in lungs adapted for altitude, in little bits of ancient DNA coiled quietly inside us. And it all began with a cave, a flicker of firelight, and a pinky bone no bigger than a pebble. Step further into the darkness of the Ice Age, and you begin to feel it, that curious weight of presence, even when nothing stirs. The Denisovans were never meant to be remembered by name. They didn't leave behind towering statues or sprawling cities. No epics etched in stone. No symbols we've decoded. And yet, their absence became louder than presence. A kind of whispering echo that makes you pause when you hear the wind. To understand them, we need to meet them where they lived, not in fossils, but in the subtle places between science and story. Because the Denisovans didn't burst onto the evolutionary scene with dramatic flair. They arrived quietly. Emerged, perhaps, from a shared ancestor with Neanderthals around 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. Then diverged. A split in the human family tree. One path went west, becoming the burly, cold-adapted Neanderthals of Europe. The other turned east, into the shadowed forests of Asia, and became Denisovans. These were not just side characters in the story of evolution. They were protagonists of their own quiet world. A forgotten species that lived, thrived, and wandered, before vanishing into time's long sleep. They likely never called themselves Denisovans, of course. That's our invention. But give them any name you like, they were our kin. If you think of human history as a campfire story told in the dark, they were one of the voices in the circle, speaking in a dialect we almost lost. They looked similar to us, but perhaps not quite. Some scientists speculate they had broader skulls and flatter faces. Perhaps their brow ridges sat higher, casting different shadows across their eyes. These aren't confirmed traits, just fragments imagined from DNA and the curve of a molar. You see, with the Denisovans, bones are scarce. We have no complete skull, no skeleton hanging in a museum case. What we know comes mostly from genetics, ancient DNA extracted from cave dirt and fossil fragments. It's like trying to learn the story of a person from a single lock of hair. But still, those fragments speak. Their DNA told us that this wasn't just a local anomaly or an isolated group. The Denisovans were widespread, stretching across Asia, possibly even reaching islands as far south as Indonesia and New Guinea. And for a species we never knew existed until 2010, that's astonishing. Imagine that, for tens of thousands of years, they lived in parallel with Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Walking the same lands, watching the same stars, drinking from the same streams. Sometimes avoiding one another. Sometimes sharing more than just space. Unlike the Neanderthals, whose fossils and tools appear frequently across Europe and the Near East, Denisovan remnants are elusive. It's as if nature herself tried to hide them, tucking away their story beneath layers of loam and ash. But nature isn't perfect at keeping secrets. DNA, that quiet archivist, kept their record in the cells of their descendants. And those descendants? You might see them today in the indigenous peoples of Melanesia, in some Aboriginal Australians, and among Tibetans and Han Chinese. Not in memory or stories passed down by words, but in genes that still function, still shape lives, still whisper. The story of the Denisovans challenges something deep in us, the idea that history is always written in visible ink. That to matter, a species must have left behind monuments or myths. But the Denisovans remind us, there are lives that matter simply because they were lived. So let's sit beside that metaphorical fire a while longer. Imagine one of them looking up at a night sky we'd still recognize, Orion overhead, the same moon casting light on the snow. Maybe they wondered what we wonder. Where do we come from? Where do we go? There's something deeply comforting in knowing we weren't alone on this planet. Not in the past, and not now. That being human has always been more of a family resemblance than a precise design. And that once, long ago, there were people who shared our world, our blood, and maybe even our dreams. Their world was one of cold nights and quiet strength. Of survival not just by brute force, but through memory, intuition, cooperation. They likely had language, not our language, but enough to name things, to warn, to soothe, to joke. You can't craft a bracelet from chlorite or make tools without thought. You don't shelter generation after generation in the same cave without passing on some kind of knowing. Denisovans weren't shadows. They were sentient beings. They laughed. They grieved. They adapted. They survived. For a time. Eventually, their fire faded. Not in a single dramatic blaze, but in a slow dimming, like the last embers of a hearth that's been burning for hours. Not extinction by catastrophe, but perhaps by dilution, merging with other humans, drifting into other bloodlines, until their distinct features were no longer distinct. Until they were part of us. And tonight, maybe that's what sleep feels like, too. Not an ending. Not an absence. Just a blending. A dimming. A soft, slow fade into something deeper and warmer. As your breathing slows and the room grows quieter, remember this: you are not the beginning of humanity. You are its continuation. You carry echoes of many voices, many faces, many lives that came before yours. Some of those voices belonged to the Denisovans. A finger bone. That's where it all started. Just a sliver, the size of a grape stem, pulled from a sediment layer that had slept untouched for tens of thousands of years. It was found in Denisova Cave in 2008, small, weathered, and at first glance, unremarkable. But inside that shard, in the ancient marrow of the pinky, a secret waited. Not a visible one. Not something you could spot with the eye. But one written in spirals, genetic spirals, unwinding like an ancient lullaby. What they found inside that tiny fragment wasn't Neanderthal. It wasn't Homo sapiens. It was something other. Related, certainly, but distant enough to be called a different species. The mitochondrial DNA suggested a lineage that branched off from our shared ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago. A missing cousin. A forgotten sibling. And if the finger bone was the whisper, then the next find was the nudge. A molar. Big. Durable. Almost too large for a human mouth, and subtly different from Neanderthal teeth. Found in the same cave, its roots strong and its shape rugged, made for chewing through the tough game of a Paleolithic winter or the fibrous plants of an Ice Age forest. Together, the molar and the finger bone started to paint a ghost. A species we never saw coming. The Denisovans, named not for what they left behind, but for where we happened to find them. They were first defined not by what we could see, but by what we could sequence. Ancient DNA techniques had matured just in time. If the same bones had been found 2 decades earlier, they might have ended up in a drawer, misclassified or misunderstood. But the late 2000s were a perfect storm of curiosity and technology. A team led by geneticists at the Max Planck Institute extracted and decoded their mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, echoing through generations like a gentle drumbeat. And what they read shocked them. The genetic divergence was deep. Too deep to be a known human type. These weren't late Neanderthals. They weren't early modern humans. They were their own branch. And that changed everything. Because up until then, our evolutionary story had felt like a two-player game. Homo sapiens versus Neanderthals, with a few side characters like Homo floresiensis or Homo erectus wandering in and out. But now, here was a new contender. Not a footnote. A whole lost chapter. And not just that. More teeth began to surface. Large molars from sites like Baishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau. The shape and wear matched. They belonged to people who likely lived at high altitudes, in freezing temperatures, breathing thin air and chewing hardy food. And with every new sample, the picture deepened. Yet still, no skull. No femur. No pelvis. Just the most durable parts of the body, teeth and bone shards. It was like the earth only allowed us to glimpse them in puzzle pieces. Frustrating, yes, but also a kind of reverence. As if their full faces are secrets not yet earned. Let's pause here, for a moment. Imagine yourself kneeling in that cave. The walls are damp. The air smells of rock and time. Your gloved hands brush away soil that hasn't been touched since before the first pyramid stone was laid. You're not looking for fame. You're listening for stories in the sediment. And suddenly, there it is. A chip of something pale. A tiny molar, staring back at you like a forgotten heirloom. It's humbling, isn't it? That we know more about distant galaxies than we do about the ancient people who once held a child's hand by firelight or left footprints in soft volcanic ash. Because the Denisovans weren't myth. They were real. Their genes linger in many of us. We carry them not in memory, but in marrow. And all it took to find them was a tooth, a finger, and the right kind of listening. DNA doesn't just tell us who they were. It tells us where they've been. Denisovan genetic signatures have now been detected in peoples across Asia and Oceania. Up to 5% of the DNA in some modern Melanesians can be traced to them. That's not a trace. That's a presence. And it means they were widespread. Not confined to one cold cave in Siberia, but likely ranging across mountains and islands, rivers and valleys, everywhere from the Altai to the Pacific shores. That raises questions. Did they build rafts? Did they follow animal herds across ice bridges? Did they have rituals for the dead or names for the stars? We may never know. But the more we listen, the more their presence takes shape, not as monsters or myths, but as people. People who once shivered beside the same rivers we now dam, who once looked up at the same moon we photograph from space. And it all started with what most would have thrown away. A single finger bone, smaller than a coin. And a molar, strong as stone. So next time you brush your teeth or hold a child's hand, remember this: you might be touching history. You might be carrying a spark that began long before your name was ever spoken. Now close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the crunch of frost underfoot, the hush of wind weaving through pine trees, and the dark quiet of early dawn on the Siberian plateau. This is where the Denisovans lived, where they breathed, hunted, slept, and dreamt. Their days began not with alarms or screens, but with the slow pink glow of sun seeping into the snow-covered branches. Theirs was a life far older, far quieter, and perhaps, far more in tune with the natural rhythm of the world. Let's drift gently into their world. We don't know the names they gave to the trees or the sky. We don't know if they called the moon Mother or Eye of Night, or if they sang to the stars. But we can imagine. And sometimes that's enough. With every archaeological find, we add another brushstroke to the canvas of their lives. A sharp-edged flint tool here, a charred piece of bone there, bits of pollen suggesting plant use. All of it whispers something. They lived. They touched this ground. Picture one of them now. A Denisovan woman, wrapped in layers of hide, crouched beside a fire that dances in the wind. Her fingers are thick and strong, her movements practiced, almost meditative. She's grinding roots against stone, the earthy smell rising in the cold air. Behind her, a child peers from a hide shelter, eyes wide with curiosity, mimicking the motion of her hands. We think of them as primitive, but perhaps we're the ones who have grown blind to simplicity. They understood the language of seasons. They read the forest's moods. They knew when the elk moved through the valley or when the bitter berries turned sweet. Evidence from Denisova Cave suggests they lived in organized groups, perhaps in extended family bands. Their tools, though simple, were effective: scrapers, blades, and hammers shaped from local stone. But the real magic is in what we don't fully understand. The polished green chlorite bracelet found in the same cave, the whole board cleanly, the surface smooth to a sheen, suggests craftsmanship, patience, even a sense of beauty. This wasn't just survival. It was attention. Intention. A slow, deliberate kind of living that left no cities but carved something deeper into time. Denisovans likely moved with the seasons, following animal herds and shifting camps as resources changed. They would have known how to store food, how to work together in harsh winters, how to mend tools with calm precision. And at night, huddled together beneath furs and bark, they told stories. Not with books or ink, but with gestures, tones, and long, soft looks around the fire. The Altai Mountains, and places like the Tibetan Plateau, offered both challenges and protection. Isolation helped shape them. High altitudes forced their bodies to adapt in extraordinary ways, ways we're still only beginning to understand. They breathed thin air like it was nothing. They endured long winters without panic. Their lungs, their hearts, their blood, all bore traces of a different way of being human. And maybe they saw us, too, early Homo sapiens passing through the steppes, eyes locked across a river, a flicker of mutual awareness. Maybe there was conflict. Maybe there was curiosity. Or maybe, as we'll soon explore, there was something much more intimate. But for now, stay here. Let's not rush forward. Let's imagine a day in their life. Morning begins with the slow crackle of firewood and the rhythmic tapping of stone on stone. Someone's making tools. Another prepares hides for warmth, scrubbing and softening them over flat rocks. A group sets out to track game, elk, deer, perhaps a mammoth if fortune favors them. Footprints press into snow. Birds scatter. The silence isn't empty. It's alive. By midday, the light is sharp and white. If they're lucky, they bring back meat. The cave fills with the scent of smoke and marrow. Children play with discarded bones, mimicking adults. Someone hums a pattern, music, memory, prayer. And at night, the wind picks up. Stars open their ancient eyes. Shadows move along the cave walls, cast by firelight and flickering souls. A story begins, maybe about the animal they just hunted, or a spirit that guards the mountains, or the ancestors who once walked across the land bridge far to the east. That's what makes the Denisovans so compelling. Not just that they existed, but that they probably lived like us in all the ways that matter. They loved. They grieved. They had preferences, favorite shelters, favorite gathering spots. They may have watched their children grow with quiet awe, mourned their elders, feared the cold, longed for spring. There is evidence they used pigments, possibly for art or ritual. Maybe they left handprints on cave walls, now long eroded. Maybe they adorned their dead. We can't say for sure. But if Neanderthals did such things, and we know they did, it's not unreasonable to believe the Denisovans did, too. So we lie here tonight, blanketed by time and thought, and we imagine. Not fantasy, but educated dreaming. Science brings the bones. Imagination gives them heartbeat. And the next time you feel overwhelmed by modern noise, think of the Denisovan way. Wake with the sun, move with the herds, sit by the fire, and speak only when the silence has listened first. That's how they lived. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part of them still alive in us. Now let your mind drift into the deeper folds of time, those blurry eons when different human species crossed paths not as abstract names in textbooks, but as living beings with needs, fears, hungers, and warmth. The Ice Age was a mosaic of movement, not a frozen, fixed moment. And into this tapestry wove the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and eventually, us. But this wasn't just cohabitation. It wasn't a silent, parallel existence. Something more intimate happened. Something ancient and profoundly human. Interbreeding. We weren't the only ones who noticed one another. They did too. Imagine the moment. Two people from different branches of humanity, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, standing in the frost. Eye to eye. Not enemies. Not animals. Simply, people. Maybe they shared a fire. Maybe they touched hands. And from that touch, something astonishing was born. We now know, through the quiet language of genetics, that Denisovans and Homo sapiens interbred. So did Denisovans and Neanderthals. This wasn't just a single odd encounter. These were repeated events, across different places and times. Evidence from modern human genomes confirms it. In people from East Asia, Oceania, and parts of South Asia, fragments of Denisovan DNA remain. Not fossils in museums, but living relics carried in skin, blood, lungs, and nerves. These genetic traces are not souvenirs, they're functional. Some are involved in the immune system, helping fight off disease. Others influence fat storage, skin traits, or even how bodies respond to the cold. One particular gene, EPAS1, inherited from Denisovans, gives people of Tibetan descent the ability to thrive in high altitudes where oxygen is scarce. That's not just biology. That's survival. That's legacy. So how did this happen? We'll never have a play-by-play, of course. But we can guess. Humans migrating out of Africa moved north and east. There, they encountered other humans. Different, yes, but close enough to understand. Communication may have been possible. Shared gestures, shared needs. In the long, cold nights, perhaps shared loneliness. It's tempting to imagine conflict. And perhaps there was some. Resources were scarce. Land was contested. But the DNA tells a more nuanced story, one of merging, not just clashing. You don't carry the genes of an enemy you simply kill. You carry the genes of someone you knew. Maybe even loved. This blending makes clear what the old textbooks never fully said. Our species is not a singular thread. It's a woven tapestry. Homo sapiens, yes, but laced with the colors and textures of others who lived and breathed and laughed long before our cities rose from stone. Let's pause here. Imagine a Denisovan camp beside a frozen river. The sky is turning violet with dusk. Smoke curls upward from fire pits. Fur-lined shelters dot the clearing like gentle hills. A stranger emerges from the forest. Not a threat, just unfamiliar. Tired. Perhaps. Lost. But also human. The Denisovans don't raise weapons. They raise eyes. A gesture is made. The fire is shared. And then, in time, a child is born. Not quite one, not quite the other. A mixture. A beginning. The child grows, learns both ways of seeing the world, carries in their bones the story of convergence. This isn't myth. This is ancestry. This is why some of us, today, carry Denisovan DNA in our cells, gifts passed down through millennia like whispered lullabies. And these aren't just random traits. They may influence your body's response to altitude, your immune resilience, your cellular oxygen flow. Tiny adaptations sculpted not by science, but by survival and love, deep in the shadowed valleys of the ancient world. It reminds us that evolution isn't always a battle. Sometimes it's a handshake. Sometimes it's a child. The boundary between them and us was never made of stone. It was porous, alive, and deeply human. Even Neanderthals, too, left their mark through interbreeding. Some modern humans carry both Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA, suggesting that long before maps and borders, the world was one wide web of wandering and connection. But Denisovans seem to have been particular contributors in the East. Their genetic legacy is strongest not in Europe, but in Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and the highlands of Papua New Guinea. This hints at migration patterns we barely understand. It suggests the Denisovans weren't confined, they were explorers. Maybe seafarers. Maybe island hoppers. Their footprints may lie beneath jungles and seas, forever hidden. And yet, they're not gone. Not really. They're in us. In the way some lungs expand in thin air. In how certain bodies retain warmth better than others. In tiny sequences of code that make no noise, but change everything. Tonight, as you breathe slowly and let your thoughts dim, remember this: you are not made of one story. You are many chapters, many languages, many peoples. Some of them vanished long ago. Some of them still whisper in your blood. The Denisovans are not extinct. They are forgotten. And now, remembered. And now we rise, higher than the forests, higher than the tree lines, up to where the clouds begin to thin and the air feels like an echo. Here, at the roof of the world, the Denisovan legacy pulses quietly inside the lungs of the living. You won't see it. You won't hear it. But step into the Himalayas, and you'll breathe it. This is where science meets story again, at the edge of breath itself. On the jagged slopes of the Tibetan Plateau, 13,000 feet above sea level, modern humans thrive where others would falter. While many would struggle with headaches, dizziness, or nausea from low oxygen, the native Tibetan people carry something remarkable within them. It's a small genetic tweak, just a shift in a single gene known as EPAS1, but it has profound effects. It allows their bodies to regulate red blood cell production more efficiently at high altitude, letting them live, walk, give birth, and even run where others gasp for air. For a while, it was a mystery. Where did this adaptation come from? How did it arise so rapidly in human populations? The answer, whispered from the deepest wells of our DNA, was Denisovans. They had lived at altitude long before Homo sapiens made the climb. Their bodies had already learned to speak the high-altitude dialect of oxygen, their genes shaped by tens of thousands of years of adaptation. And when modern humans eventually interbred with Denisovans, they inherited more than just a few quirks, they inherited survival. That single gene, EPAS1, is thought to have passed into humans through that ancient contact. Without it, entire populations might have never settled the highlands. Villages might have remained in the valleys. And the very fabric of Tibetan culture might never have woven itself into the clouds. Think about that. A species we didn't even know existed until 2010 has helped shape the lives of people alive today. It's not just fascinating, it's humbling. The Denisovans didn't build temples or empires, but they left a living monument in the blood of shepherds, monks, and children who now breathe in the thin silence of Himalayan air. And they did so without ever knowing they would. No intention. No plan. Just a moment, one person meeting another, and a gene slipping quietly across a species boundary like a secret passed in sleep. Let's go deeper. Not metaphorically. Truly deeper, into a cave on the edge of the Tibetan plateau called Baishia Karst Cave. It's perched at 10,000 feet, a wind-scoured hollow where bone and dust have gathered for ages. There, in the shadows, scientists discovered a lower jawbone. Not from a Neanderthal. Not from a Homo sapiens. The molars, large and sturdy, the structure thick and heavy, it matched no known species exactly. The jaw was dated to 160,000 years ago. And when proteins from the bone were tested, the clues were clear: Denisovan. They had lived there, laughed there, died there. That discovery reshaped our map of ancient humanity. It showed that Denisovans weren't just lingering in Siberia. They had made the climb. They had lived in the thin air of the world's highest mountains, long before our kind ever dared. We don't know what they called the mountains. We don't know what they believed about the snow or the stars. But their presence endures. Their adaptation became our inheritance. And that inheritance lives on in every high-altitude breath drawn by those whose ancestors met a Denisovan once, long ago. It's one thing to find fossils in a cave. It's another to realize those fossils have shaped someone's heartbeat today. That's the kind of science that feels like poetry. It's also a reminder: evolution doesn't happen only in grand, sweeping waves. Sometimes, it takes just a quiet exchange between two strangers beneath a mountain sky. A moment of contact. A child. And a gift that will echo across ages. As you lay here now, your chest rising and falling in the comfort of soft air, imagine the silence of the Tibetan highlands. The wind pushes against stone. Snow drifts over ancient paths. Somewhere, high above the clouds, a Denisovan once stood, watching the horizon, lungs full and strong, unaware that the shape of their breath would one day be carried by someone else. And in this way, they endure. Not as statues. Not as myths. But as molecules. As memory. As breath. They weren't just survivors of the Ice Age, they were teachers. Quiet ones. Unseen. But their legacy lingers in the very places where survival is hardest, where the cold is cruel, and where the air is thin. If you've ever marveled at how adaptable the human body is, remember, it's not just human. It's inherited. It's shared. It's ancient. That's the story the Denisovans left us. Not in words. Not in cave paintings. But in something far more intimate: our ability to endure, to evolve, and to breathe in places where life should be impossible. So rest easy tonight. Let each breath be a reminder. The wind in your lungs may carry whispers from ancestors you've never known. And among them, softly and surely, are the forgotten people of the highlands. The Denisovans. Let the quiet settle in again, as we descend from the wind-whipped cliffs and return to the earth, where stone tells stories if you're patient enough to listen. Beneath the soil, scattered across wide plateaus and forest glades, lie tools shaped by hands that no longer exist. Flint flakes. Hammer stones. Shards with purpose. Each one is a footprint of thought, a sign that the Denisovans weren't just bodies built for harsh weather, but minds tuned to solve problems in silence. Though the Denisovans left behind few physical traces, the tools they used whisper of an intelligence that's harder to measure than bones. Stone tools found at Denisova Cave and other locations suggest they knew how to adapt to their environment with care. Their toolkit wasn't chaotic. It was consistent, intentional, and that points to planning, cooperation, maybe even teaching. The objects are simple: scrapers for hide, blades for butchering, pointed tips for hunting. But behind every tool is a mind that imagined its use before it existed. That's the quiet intelligence of ancient people, not in the complexity of their inventions, but in the simplicity of their solutions. And then there's the bracelet. Remember that green chlorite bracelet we mentioned? It deserves more than a passing glance. Its craftsmanship suggests something different, something softer than survival. It shows an aesthetic sense, a value placed on symmetry, polish, and perhaps even beauty. It might have been worn for status, or ritual, or remembrance. Its hole, drilled with what appears to be remarkable precision, may have required tools or techniques more advanced than we assumed Denisovans had. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we've always underestimated what can't be proven with fossils. Maybe intelligence doesn't always mean fire and invention. Maybe it also means knowing which rocks to choose for carving, which firs will keep out the wind, which branches bend without breaking. Because even silence can be clever. In the Denisova Cave, layers of sediment reveal multiple occupations by different human species. At least one of these layers, the one containing Denisovan remains, shows clear evidence of structured living. Hearths, deliberate placement of tools, repeated use of the same spaces. That's not random wandering. That's a rhythm. That's a place made into a home. And it's not just in Siberia. Similar tools have been found far to the east, in places like northern China. Some researchers believe these may also be the work of Denisovans, suggesting they ranged far and wide. Their territory may have stretched across much of Asia, from cold mountain plateaus to temperate lowlands. If true, they were not just survivors, they were strategists. Nomads who understood the pulse of landscapes. But even more intriguing is how much we don't find. The Denisovans left behind very little artwork, if any. No obvious burials. No flutes or figurines. At least, none that we've found. But does that mean they didn't have stories? That they didn't dance, or dream, or grieve? Or could it mean that time simply washed those things away? After all, not every culture carves itself into cliffs. Some pass themselves on through rhythm, through breath, through gesture, through the way a tool is passed from elder to child. And that's just as valid, just as intelligent. We tend to measure intelligence by what we build. But what about what we choose not to build? What if the Denisovans didn't need towering monuments? What if they saw the world not as something to conquer, but something to live within? It's possible they hunted in coordinated groups, reading animal tracks like books, watching the sky for signs of weather. It's likely they shared food, cared for the sick, learned from failure. That's intelligence too. The kind that doesn't shout, it listens. And maybe, in a way, they were the most balanced of us all. Because here's a thought: we often view the past as leading inevitably toward us, as though we are the final chapter. But what if the Denisovans had found their own equilibrium? A way to live with the land, not against it. A way to use tools without hoarding them. A way to think, to plan, and yet remain still enough that we barely notice their passing. Maybe that's why we've struggled to find their cities, their graves, their art. Maybe their intelligence wasn't meant to leave behind monuments. Maybe it was meant to leave behind genes. A survival code passed not through stone, but through life. A child taught how to scrape a hide. A woman teaching another how to shape a blade. Knowledge passed hand to hand, mouth to ear. No books. No script. Just memory, etched into practice. And in that sense, they were no different from us. We pass on wisdom, too. Through lullabies. Through gestures. Through the quiet rituals of daily life that no one writes down but everyone remembers. So tonight, as you rest and your own mind begins to quiet, let that be the image that lingers. Not a forgotten race of brutes, but a people who solved problems without ever needing to shout. Who shaped stone with thought. Who lit fires with patience. who made things with care, who vanished without a sound, but left behind the quiet proof of their brilliance. The Denisovans didn't need to speak loudly. Their tools spoke for them. Now we reach the edge of what's visible. Not the edge of their world, ours. Because some stories aren't written in caves or carved into stone. Some are whispered in the blueprint of life itself, passed down like a code through centuries of sleep. And so we begin to follow the ghosts. Not the haunting kind. The genetic kind. There's a term scientists use for this phenomenon: ghost populations. These are ancient humans we've never found in the flesh, but who left fingerprints all over our DNA. We don't have their skulls or their tools. No bracelets. No ashes. And yet, when scientists sequence our genomes, they find shadows that don't belong to any known species. Unexpected sequences. Odd patterns. Entire genetic chapters that say, someone else was here. And again, Denisovans are at the center. You see, when researchers began comparing modern human genomes, especially those of indigenous populations in Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and parts of the Pacific, they noticed something strange. People from these regions carried more Denisovan DNA than others. Sometimes as much as 5% of their genetic material. That's not a whisper. That's a presence. But there's more. Because when they looked closer, they discovered different kinds of Denisovan DNA. As if these fragments came from not just one population, but multiple Denisovan lineages, each distinct, each shaped by their own journeys through time. Imagine that. Not a single species, but a family tree within a family tree. Denisovans who had split off from one another, evolving separately in distant lands, adapting to their own climates, their own challenges. Some may have lived in cold mountain forests, others on humid islands. Some may have never met each other at all. And yet, all of them mingled with us. Which means we, too, are not a single story. We are a library of encounters. A woven record of bodies touching, breathing, becoming. Every thread of Denisovan DNA in our cells is a chapter from a ghost population we never saw, but who saw us. It gets more haunting still. Some of these ghost signatures appear in places we never expected, deep in the ancestry of East Asian, Polynesian, and Filipino populations. These genetic traces don't match the known Denisovan genome exactly. They're cousins of the Siberian cave dwellers. Similar, but not the same. Which means, somewhere out there, perhaps beneath jungle soil or lost beneath rising seas, there were other Denisovan groups we haven't found. Other people. Other fires. Other stories. It's almost like nature keeps hiding pages from the book, just to see if we'll keep reading. And we do. Because science now has a flashlight, ancient DNA technology. It doesn't just tell us who we are. It tells us who we once met. Who we once lost. You see, DNA doesn't forget. Even when bones turn to dust. Even when names are never spoken aloud. The code remembers. And it reveals. It reveals that some of us carry Denisovan genes that help regulate blood sugar. Others carry immunity traits, perhaps to fight viruses or bacterial invaders. Some of us might carry fragments we've barely begun to understand. Genetic shadows we'll only decode years from now. But those shadows have weight. They shape how our bodies behave. How we heal. How we breathe. How we endure. And that's not all. Because inside us, sometimes, the DNA of Denisovans and Neanderthals meets again, within the same individual. People today exist who carry fragments from both species. A blending of ancient tribes, rekindled in our bloodstreams. So ask yourself this, as your breathing slows and your eyelids grow heavy. What does it mean to carry the genes of the unseen? What does it mean to have been shaped by someone you'll never meet? It means you are older than you think, wiser than you know, and more connected than you'll ever fully understand. Because even if you've never hiked the Himalayas, even if you've never chipped a flint tool or sat beside a cave fire, some part of you remembers. Not consciously, not in words, but in breath, in cells, in the way your body moves through the world. You are not just the product of one lineage, one land, one time. You are the echo of many. You are Homo sapiens, yes. But you are also a little bit ghost. And these ghosts don't haunt you. They carry you. They shaped your ancestors' lungs, their skin, their bones, their sleep. And in some mysterious, beautiful way, they shaped your dreams too. So when you rest tonight, think of them not as strangers, but as kin you simply haven't met. Ancestors not by story, but by code, by touch, by the unspoken poetry of evolution. They left no names, but they left you. By now, you're beginning to feel them, not just as scattered fragments or DNA sequences, but as people, flesh and bone, mind and movement. And as we drift further into their story, a deeper truth unfolds. The Denisovans were not alone in the shadows of prehistory. They had company. They had family. And in this family, there were others who had once branched off the same ancient route. Let's return briefly to the beginning. Around 700,000 years ago, somewhere in Africa or Eurasia, a common ancestor of humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans walked the earth. This ancestor eventually gave rise to three distinct lineages. One moved south and evolved into us, Homo sapiens. Another moved west and became Neanderthals. The third, moving east into the vast forests and mountains of Asia, quietly grew into what we now call the Denisovans. Imagine them now as siblings. Distant, divergent, but related. And like many siblings, they didn't always live side by side. They explored different territories, adapted to different pressures, and in doing so, they became different beings. The Neanderthals, broad and stocky, developed tools for hunting big game in colder, open regions. They buried their dead. They painted in caves. They built fires in the crooks of limestone shelters. They were masters of the Ice Age in Europe and the Near East. The Denisovans? Their path was quieter, harder to trace. They ventured into higher altitudes, denser forests, and farther coasts. While the Neanderthals left behind rich archaeological signatures, the Denisovans left mostly genetic echoes. But their paths crossed. More than once. Evidence from the Denisova cave suggests that these two species, so closely related, yet so distinct, inhabited the same site, though not always at the same time. Layers of sediment show alternating traces, a Neanderthal here, a Denisovan there. And then, sometimes, traces of both, mingled. That means interaction. That means contact. But more than just meetings, they left behind something even more profound, shared descendants. Interbreeding wasn't rare. It happened multiple times. Multiple locations. Enough that some Denisovans today carry Neanderthal genes. And vice versa. Think about that. Two extinct species merging, not vanishing. Converging like rivers whose waters still swirl inside us. And here's where the story gets beautifully intimate. In 2018, researchers studying bones from Denisova Cave made a discovery that stunned even the most seasoned scientists. A small fragment of bone, thought to be from a teenager, held something astonishing. She was a first-generation hybrid. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father, Denisovan. They named her Denny. We'll speak more about her later, but remember this now. These two different human species weren't so different after all. Their hearts beat the same way. Their hands shaped tools in similar ways. They shared breath, shared warmth, and, as it turns out, shared children. That raises big questions. Were these species even truly separate? Or were they simply branches that bent toward one another whenever the wind changed? Because from the outside, the evolutionary tree looks neat, branches labeled and spaced. But from within, it's tangled, overlapping, alive, a web, not a line. And perhaps that's how it always was. Let your mind wander to a meeting long ago, somewhere in a forest clearing. A Denisovan hunting party pauses at a river's edge. Across the bank, a Neanderthal group emerges. They look. They watch. And instead of running, they approach. Slowly. Cautiously. Not enemies. Just unfamiliar. Maybe they share food. Maybe they exchange tools. Maybe someone smiles. And maybe, from that smile, something begins. That's the quiet heart of this story. These weren't titanic clashes of civilizations. There were no armies, no borders, just people, drawn together by instinct, curiosity, or chance. We don't know if they spoke the same language, or any language at all. But communication isn't always verbal. A gesture, a gaze, a shared rhythm of breath beside a fire. That's how life continues. Not in grand declarations, but in closeness. And perhaps there's a lesson in that. We so often focus on how we differ, species, tribes, bloodlines. But evolution tells a gentler tale. It shows us how, even when split by time and distance, we find our way back to one another. Again and again. The Denisovans and Neanderthals were not so far apart. Neither are we. As you rest tonight, as the world outside your window fades into darkness, remember this: you come from many paths. From people who wandered. People who crossed mountains, glacier, and rivers. People who met others, saw something familiar in their eyes, and chose not to fight. They chose to merge. The Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't leave behind rival flags or battlefields. They left behind a girl named Denny. Half one thing, half another. Fully human. Utterly remarkable. And maybe that's all the legacy anyone needs. Let's return now to the most delicate trace of this whole story, her. The child of two worlds. A girl whose very bones bridged a genetic gulf once thought uncrossable. Denny. Just a nickname, of course. She never had the chance to name herself. But the scientists who found her gave her a place in our story, because her bones gave us something we never expected: undeniable proof of deep interconnection. Her remains were nothing more than a small, fragmented piece of long bone, about the size of a marble. Crushed. Indistinct. But inside that bone lived a time capsule. Her DNA was intact enough to sequence. And what it revealed was extraordinary. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. Not a hybrid several generations down the line. Not someone with diluted ancestry. She was a direct child of two distinct human species. The first of her kind ever discovered. Denny wasn't symbolic. She was real. Flesh and blood. A teenage girl who likely lived and died in the same Denisova cave where both her lineages once crossed paths. We don't know how she died. There were no signs of trauma, no dramatic cause. Just quiet disappearance into the earth, preserved by cold and time. But in her short life, Denny held something priceless: the union of two ancient peoples. And her genome didn't just end at her parents. It whispered deeper stories. Her Denisovan father, it turned out, had Neanderthal ancestry himself, suggesting that the intermingling of these species happened over and over again, across generations, across vast landscapes, over thousands of years. Think of what that means. It wasn't just one moment of contact. It was many. A slow and quiet weaving of lives. These weren't isolated species peering at each other across evolutionary cliffs. They were interwoven, flowing into one another like water in a delta, shifting, merging, branching again. And Denny stands at one of those crossroads. Let's imagine her, not in the lens of science, but in the softness of life. A young girl, perhaps no older than 13 or 14. Maybe she had a favorite spot near the cave entrance, where the light was just warm enough in the morning. Maybe she liked to chase the birds away from the campfire scraps. Maybe she had a laugh that echoed off the stone. She wouldn't have known what she represented. She wouldn't have understood the weight of her bloodline. To her, life was immediate. Cold mornings. Hunger. Warmth beside others. The comfort of voices. The scent of meat on stone. That's all she needed. And yet, in her DNA, the entire history of ancient humanity was entangled. The scientists who studied her bones described it like this: finding her was like discovering that a polar bear and a brown bear had a cub, and that cub left behind perfect evidence. But this wasn't about animals. This was about people. About what it means to belong. About the arbitrary lines we draw between us and them. Because here's the truth: Denny wasn't an outlier. She was part of a larger pattern. Evidence now suggests that interbreeding between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens occurred repeatedly. The boundaries were fluid. Identities blurred. The idea of pure species begins to dissolve the closer we look. And maybe that's the point. Evolution isn't clean. It's messy, beautiful, and deeply human. You, lying there tonight with your breath slowing and your thoughts softening, might carry fragments of Denny's people. A bit of Neanderthal resilience. A Denisovan trait that lets your blood regulate better at altitude. You are, in some invisible way, an echo of that meeting. And Denny herself? She reminds us that species are not walls. They are thresholds. They are invitations. And sometimes, they lead to new life. But let's not forget the tenderness of it all. Because this isn't just about biology. It's about love. Or at least, connection. A Neanderthal woman and a Denisovan man shared more than space. They shared something that led to her. A child. A future. A link across evolutionary divides. Perhaps they sat together by firelight. Perhaps they spoke with hands more than words. Perhaps their union was brief. Perhaps it was deep. We'll never know. But they created something that carried forward. And for that, we remember them. There's something deeply peaceful in that. In knowing that the divisions we imagine, between races, species, tribes, have always been thinner than we thought. That we are more interwoven than we've ever truly acknowledged. That sometimes, a girl named Denny can hold 1,000 generations inside her. And even if she is gone, even if her bones crumble to dust, her story remains. A soft thread pulled from the fabric of time. Not loud. Not long. But vital. So as you drift towards sleep, remember her, not as a symbol of extinction, but as a symbol of unity. Of blending. Of the quiet miracles that happen when walls fall and bridges rise. And know this, your body, too, holds ancient meetings. Forgotten fires. Unspoken names. Somewhere, deep in your marrow, there are stories still unfolding. Now let your breath slow, just a little more. Because we're entering the quietest part of the story, the part where the fires have gone cold, where the footprints are fading under dust, and where the Denisovans begin to disappear from the record. Not in a blaze of extinction. Not with fanfare or calamity. But with silence. With absence. With a kind of vanishing that feels more like dissolving than dying. The question hangs in the chilled air. Where did they go? There are no mass graves. No fossil beds filled with evidence of plague or war. No obvious signs of climate disaster sweeping them away in a single dramatic wave. In fact, if we weren't looking so closely, we might never even realize they had left. Because unlike the sudden end of the dinosaurs, or the sharp genetic bottlenecks that hit early Homo sapiens, the Denisovans seem to have faded gradually. Their disappearance is quiet. Diffuse. A soft ending. One theory suggests competition. As modern humans spread across Eurasia, perhaps Denisovans were slowly pushed out, territory by territory, resource by resource. Not through warfare, necessarily, but through subtle ecological pressure. We may have simply been more flexible, more communicative, perhaps better at sharing knowledge across generations. Or maybe we brought diseases their immune systems hadn't met before. Still, we should be cautious with such assumptions. It's tempting to cast ourselves as the inevitable victors of a prehistoric drama, but that narrative makes us forget the richness of those who came before. Others suggest climate was a silent antagonist. As the last ice age advanced and retreated in waves, the environments Denisovans had adapted to shifted beneath their feet. Forests changed. Prey patterns altered. Mountains once familiar grew unfamiliar. And perhaps, slowly, they failed to keep pace. But maybe the answer is stranger still. Maybe the Denisovans didn't go anywhere. Maybe they just stopped being only Denisovan. Because their DNA didn't vanish. It flowed forward. Into other peoples. Other lineages. Other names. Maybe what disappeared was not the species, but the boundary. Over time, their features blurred. Their distinct traits mixed into others, until there was no one left who was fully Denisovan, but no one who didn't carry something of them either. This is the quiet triumph of genetic legacy. To be remembered not in statues or scrolls, but in the oxygen in someone's blood, in the cold hardiness of a mountain shepherd, in the way someone's cells fight off infection without them even knowing why. To fade is not always to fail. It's possible that in the late stages of their existence, Denisovans lived in smaller, more scattered populations. Isolated by mountains, rivers, or the growing reach of Homo sapiens, they may have merged with their neighbors. A Denisovan man marries into a human clan. A child is born. Her jaw is wider, her skin darker, her lungs a little stronger. And no one calls her Denisovan. She's just one of them. Generation by generation, the name fades. But the traits remain. And isn't that, in some ways, the most natural form of continuity? To become part of the river that carries forward, even if no one remembers where the tributary began? It's also possible that, in some corners of the earth, Denisovans lasted longer than we thought. Undetected, unburied, unlabeled. Just people, living out lives on high plateaus or in dense forests, eventually blending so completely into the communities around them that they cease to be seen as anything separate. If so, they wouldn't be extinct. They would be absorbed. Tonight, think of them not as a lost people, but as travelers who took a different path, and then, halfway through, stepped into ours. A quiet merging, a shared fire, and then silence. But not the silence of erasure, the silence of presence. Because sometimes, the things that endure don't shout. They hum. They live in the shape of a bone, in the density of hair, in the way your body acclimates to a mountain hike without you knowing why. They live in you. And so maybe this isn't a mystery at all. Maybe it's exactly what they intended. No monuments. No graves. Just quiet, enduring echoes. And what could be more human than that? So as you close your eyes and the night draws in around you, know this: we don't always get to choose how we are remembered. But the Denisovans remind us that to be remembered at all, by breath, by cell, by spark, is enough. They are not missing. They are part of us. Now we turn inward, not to bones or caves, but to the very architecture of your body. Because this is where the Denisovans truly live. Not in museums, not in ancient artifacts behind glass, but in your chromosomes. In microscopic spirals of code passed down through generations like sacred instructions whispered in the dark. You carry them. Or at least, many of us do. And that realization changes everything. It means the Denisovans didn't simply vanish, they integrated. Their story continues not as a fading myth but as a living force quietly shaping modern humanity. And now, the more scientists look, the more of these ancient traces they find. Traces that don't just exist, they matter. Let's start with a quiet miracle, EPAS1, the Denisovan gene that helps modern Tibetans survive in the thin air of the Himalayas. We've talked about it before, but now let's go deeper. This gene regulates how the body responds to low oxygen. Without it, people living at high elevations often develop thicker blood, a dangerous condition that can lead to heart complications. But with it, the body remains balanced. Oxygen is used more efficiently. Life above the clouds becomes not only possible but sustainable. And this adaptation didn't emerge slowly over thousands of generations. It was inherited, all at once, from Denisovans. A genetic shortcut. A gift. And it's not the only one. Denisovan DNA also appears to play a role in the immune system. Certain immune response genes, especially those involved in fighting off viruses, show signs of ancient introgression. In other words, Denisovan genes may help modern humans better resist some infections. Imagine that. You ward off illness today because of something someone inherited 50,000 years ago in a cold, windswept cave. Other Denisovan traits are more mysterious. Some are involved in fat metabolism, possibly helping the body store energy more efficiently in cold climates. Others might affect how skin responds to sunlight, particularly useful for populations living under intense UV exposure at high altitudes or equatorial regions. Still more may influence how our bodies respond to particular nutrients or environmental toxins. And some genetic variants, while subtle, could affect development, fertility, even brain chemistry. These are not dominant genes. They are fragments. Threads. But threads can shape the entire weave. And yet, we often overlook them. Because they're not obvious. They don't define us, but they refine us. They add texture. They add resilience. They remind us that human evolution wasn't a solo journey. It was a crowded road. And many who walked beside us left fingerprints on who we are today. There's another twist. Not all Denisovan DNA is created equal. Scientists have found evidence that multiple Denisovan populations contributed to modern human genomes. That means the Denisovans were not a single, unified group. They were a constellation of related but distinct lineages, scattered across Asia and beyond. Some of their DNA appears only in East Asians. Other variants show up in Melanesians. Some are shared between different populations. Some are unique. It's like finding footprints on different shores, proving they traveled widely, and they touched more lives than we ever imagined. And the more we sequence, the more we find. In fact, some genetic researchers now argue that the Denisovans might have been more genetically diverse than modern humans. That their range was broader. Their adaptations more varied. Their branches longer. So why did they leave so little behind? That question haunts archaeologists. Because while their DNA is plentiful, their artifacts are sparse. It's like seeing shadows without bodies. Like hearing a song with no source. But maybe that's not strange. Maybe they lived lightly. Maybe they didn't bury their dead in ways we recognize. Maybe they lived in places we haven't yet explored, or places now lost beneath the ocean or swallowed by jungle. And maybe it's our expectations that are wrong. Maybe the greatest monument to the Denisovans isn't in stone. It's in us. Because to leave behind a legacy in DNA is not a lesser form of remembrance. It is the most intimate kind. It shapes how lungs expand, how hearts beat, how bodies endure hardship. And those influences, quiet though they may be, are profound. You don't see them in the mirror, but they see you. They help you wake up every morning. They help you breathe. So tonight, as you lie still, reflect on this. Within you might be ancient instructions crafted by people who hunted in silence, who lived beneath stars we still name, who held fires close and each other closer. They didn't write books or raise temples, but they gave you a little of their strength. You are not merely descended from greatness. You contain it. In your mitochondria. In your marrow. In the parts of you that never had a name, but always had a purpose. That's how we remember them. Not in textbooks. In breath. Now let's pause, and listen to what isn't written in DNA. What isn't held in bones or tools. Because somewhere, deep in the frozen nights of prehistory, there were voices. Not scientific ones. Not even ours. But theirs. The Denisovans. We don't know the words they spoke, if any. We don't know if they had language like ours, or symbols, or stories carved into wood or stone. But does it matter? All humans tell stories, even when they don't speak them. Tonight, imagine a quiet fire flickering in the mouth of a mountain cave. Around it, fur-clad figures sit close. A mother hums softly as she holds a child. A grandfather stares into the flames with a distant, remembering look. Across from him, a younger adult carefully chips at a stone, rhythmically tapping out a tool from a fresh flake of obsidian. And above them, the stars burn exactly as they do now. It's here that we can begin to feel something closer to the Denisovans, not as a mystery to solve, but as a presence. As people who had beliefs. Or at the very least, feelings. Because survival alone isn't the whole story. A species doesn't leave behind intricately polished bracelets or carefully chosen burial sites unless there's more going on than hunger and cold. There is curiosity. There is reverence. There is a reach for meaning. Imagine what they might have believed. Perhaps the mountains were gods. Or maybe they believed the cold wind was a spirit moving through the trees. Perhaps death was a journey, a return to the earth that had always fed them. Or maybe the stars were ancestors, watching with patient eyes. These are not wild guesses. Neanderthals showed signs of ritual and symbolic behavior. Burials with flowers, red ochre pigments, even perforated shells that may have been worn as ornaments. And if Neanderthals did it, is it so strange to think the Denisovans did, too? In fact, the bracelet we've spoken of, carved from green chlorite, polished and drilled, suggests symbolic value. It's not just functional. It's beautiful. And beauty is never accidental. Maybe it was worn by someone of status. Or by a child, as a charm. Maybe it was used in a ceremony. Maybe it was passed down like a treasure through generations. Or maybe it was buried with someone, placed on their wrist as a final gesture of love. And that's the thing. Gestures. So much of ancient life was built not just on function, but on feeling. A fire isn't just heat, it's togetherness. A tool isn't just survival, it's teaching. A shelter isn't just safety, it's home. Picture a Denisovan night. Outside, snow falling like whispers. The woods creak in the wind. A hunted deer hangs from a post, its meat already smoked, its hide scraped and drying. Inside the cave, low voices, the warmth of bodies. A child sleeps curled against their sibling, breathing softly. Someone hums a tune that's half lullaby, half memory. The smell of herbs burned for scent or ritual lingers in the air. There is no writing, but there is memory. There are no cities, but there is community. There is no religion, but there is awe. You don't need words to believe in something bigger. You don't need gods to feel gratitude for the stars. You don't need a priest to bury your dead with care. The Denisovans may have understood, in their own quiet way, that life was sacred, that it moved in rhythms, that it ended, and that it came back again. And maybe that's what their silence has been saying all along. Not we were forgotten, but we were here. And still are. Because while they left no written prayers or temples built to last, they left you. They left genetic hymns in your blood, quiet echoes of their own survival. They left the possibility that even the least documented people can leave the deepest impression, not in stone, but in soul. So as you lay here tonight, soft beneath your blanket, your breath slow and deep, think of their fires. Think of how they might have watched the sky and wondered, just as you do. Think of the way their hands shaped stone the way yours might shape clay or pages or keys. Think of the quiet or they must have felt when a child was born or when a storm passed safely overhead. And then ask yourself, what makes a species human? Is it language? Art? Tombs? Or is it something older still? A shared look. A shared silence. A shared fire. That's where humanity begins. That's where it always has. And perhaps, that's what the Denisovans gave us. Not only their blood, not only their lungs, but their stillness. Their grace. Their ability to live closely with the world, not loudly against it. They may not have had temples, but they had nights. And in those nights, they sat under the stars, just like you. Now we drift closer. Not toward the end, but toward the center, the quiet truth that has been unfolding beneath every word. The Denisovans were never strangers. Not really. In fact, parts of them may be alive in you. Not just in your breath or bones, but in the very shape of who you are. Because DNA isn't just a code. It's a memory. And in that memory, their echoes are still playing, faint melodies humming in your immune system, in your muscle strength, in your blood's quiet rhythm. These aren't metaphors. These are molecular facts. Let's trace one. If you've ever hiked in the cold and found yourself surprisingly resilient, or adjusted faster than others to high elevations without breathlessness, it's possible you're carrying a gift from long ago. Not a superpower. Just a whisper of an ancient adaptation, handed down over millennia. Maybe it came from a Denisovan ancestor who once braced against wind on a Tibetan ridge, who hunted yak, or sheltered in a cliffside cave. That strength didn't end with them. It passed on. It lives on. Now imagine another gift. Your body's ability to respond to viruses it's never met. There are ancient immune system genes in some of us that come not from Homo sapiens, but from Denisovans. Defensive blueprints. Strategies forged in the deep past, shaped by ice age plagues and parasites we no longer remember. And still, our bodies remember. But it's not just survival. Some of us may carry Denisovan contributions to our sense of smell, to the way our skin reacts to sun, to our sleep patterns, to our metabolism. Most of these traits don't have names. They don't show up on the surface. But they are there, subtly shaping the way we move through the world. We often think of the past as behind us. But the Denisovans are not behind us. They are within. And maybe that's what makes them so haunting. Not because they're gone, but because they never fully left. They aren't extinct. They are integrated. Invisible passengers in our biology. Ancient hands still resting on our shoulders, guiding us quietly. Even the shape of your skull, the depth of your jaw, the density of your bones, these could carry ancient signatures. Tiny anatomical nods to a species who lived in forests, scaled cliffs, and whispered beside firelight. We like to imagine clear lines, Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo sapiens, as though we were islands. But evolution doesn't honor lines. It favors bridges. It favors crossing over. And in the end, your body is a bridge. A blend of many peoples, many places, many forgotten fires. Some of those fires burned in the hearts of Denisovan families, perhaps before the last ice age even began. They loved. They worried. They endured. And somewhere in all that living, they left pieces of themselves behind. Not in tombs. In you. So the next time someone asks what it means to be human, think carefully. Because the answer is not just history. It's not even just biology. It's belonging. It's being part of a chain of lives so old, so wide, and so interwoven, that no single person can claim ownership of the human story. The Denisovans are a reminder of that. They show us that we are not the product of isolation, but of connection. That we are not one flame, but many sparks gathered over time, sheltering each other from the dark. And that even if you don't know their names, your cells remember. They carry ancient maps, ancient stories, ancient endurance. Even now, as you lie still in the dark, those stories unfold. Because your body is not just you. It is many yesterdays, braided into one breath. And in those yesterdays, the Denisovans live. So here we are, at the edge of the map. The place where words grow quiet and imagination has to finish what evidence began. We've wandered from the frostbitten mouth of Denisova Cave to the breathless peaks of the Tibetan Plateau. We've followed genes across continents, met children of two species, and listened for echoes in our own blood. And now, all that remains is to sit still. And remember, the Denisovans didn't build pyramids. They didn't leave golden masks or marble columns. No poems survive them. No myths whisper their names. Yet their legacy may be closer to you than your own reflection. Because history is not only told by those who speak the loudest. Sometimes, it's held in the quiet strength of lungs that don't give out when the air thins. In blood that doesn't betray you under stress. In immune systems fine-tuned by hands you'll never see. Sometimes, history doesn't speak at all. It breathes. And this is what the Denisovans gave us. Proof that humanity was never one clean, unbroken line, but a weaving. A crossing over. A choosing, not to remain apart, but to come together. Again and again. Fire shared between strangers. Shelter extended without question. Lives merged. Boundaries dissolved. And that's why they matter. Not just because they were our kin, but because they remind us what it means to be human. To adapt. To collaborate. To blur the line between us and them until it disappears. They are a lesson in humility. A whisper in a time of noise. They show us that history is not always written. Sometimes, it's simply lived, and passed on. So the next time you step outside and look up at the stars, know this, those same stars once glimmered in the eyes of Denisovan children. They saw constellations we never named. They made choices we'll never trace. But one of those choices, one small moment, led to you. And now, the wind down begins. So let's slow down together. Let the pace soften, like snow falling on pine branches. Let the images drift into the background, where the fire of their world still flickers, dim, but not gone. Not gone at all. You're lying here now, but part of you remembers. The part you didn't earn. The part passed to you like a gift too ancient to unwrap. A heartbeat echoing through thousands of winters. The memory of mountain air. The patience of hands shaping stone. The hush of nights without electric hums, only breath, and flame, and sky. That's what you carry. You are not just someone who learned about the Denisovans tonight. You are someone shaped by them. Let that sink into your bones. Breathe in, slowly. And as you exhale, picture the inside of the cave again. Not cold now, but warm with firelight. The shadows on the walls are not empty, they are filled with quiet stories. Hands. Faces. Forgotten names that never needed to be spoken, because they were lived. Let them fade gently now. Let the cave grow dim. Let the mountain close its eyes. And let yours close, too. You've traveled tens of thousands of years tonight. But now the journey ends in stillness. In knowing. The Denisovans didn't disappear. They became part of us. And through us, in some beautiful, humble way, they dream again.